Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Winecast. This is a re-edition of the cast on kosher wine that was one of the first winecasts that I released. Now that I've settled on a particular platform for these casts, I've gotten to know the tech better and have some experience doing casting, I thought a couple of early casts might benefit from a little tightening up and reissuing. As I said in the first version of this cast, kosher wine is an important topic in the wine world. You'd be hard-pressed to find a decent wine shop that doesn't at least have a modest selection of kosher bottles. And kosher wine is produced in all wine styles at all quality levels throughout the world. But it's still a little understood aspect of wine by most consumers. With that said, let's have a look at kosher wines. But first, we should start out with a couple of quick observations about what kosher is and what it isn't. First off, a basic definition. Kosher food, including wine, is food that traditionally observant Jews are permitted to eat according to their religious law. The word kosher is an English rendering of a Hebrew word that means fit, as in fit for Jewish consumption, and this just means that a kosher food is a food that the Jewish tradition believes their God, the God of Abraham, permits Jews to consume. Kosher is an adjective, and the noun form of this word, kashrus, or kosherness, is often a better term for talking about the system of laws and customs having to do with Jewish dietary law. The basis for these laws starts out in the Hebrew Bible, primarily in the 11th chapter of the book of Leviticus, but gets elaborated to a high level of detail in subsequent texts and commentaries by scholars called rabbis. Speaking of rabbis, one thing that you'll hear a lot of when the topic of kashrus comes up is that a kosher food or wine gets its kosher status because it's been blessed by a rabbi. It's amazing how often you hear this because it's flat out not true. Yeah, rabbis were incredibly important in spelling out and developing the laws of kashrus, but when it comes to determining the kosher status of a particular food or drink, the key player is someone called a mashgiach, or a kosher supervisor. A mashgiach is a person, almost always a man, who's trained in the halacha, or Jewish law surrounding kashrus, and who supervises food and wine to make sure that they remain kosher during their production. See, kosher foods normally start out that way and lose their kosher status if they've been improperly handled, processed, or come into certain kinds of contact with non-kosher products. So the trick in kashrus isn't making something kosher, it's keeping it that way through careful supervision. Because rabbis usually have extensive training in the halacha, or laws of kashrus, they can be mashgiachs, but lots and lots of mashgiachs aren't rabbis, and in any event, even though blessing food is an important part of Jewish tradition, no one's blessing food to make it kosher, and no amount of blessing will turn an unkosher food into a kosher one. A final general observation. A lot of people have the impression that kosher wine has to be either sweet, of low quality, or both. Sadly, kosher wine came by some of this reputation honestly, but it still requires a second look. One of the places in Jewish life where wine plays a big role is in welcoming and celebrating Shabbos, or the Sabbath. And there's a long-standing custom to welcome Shabbos with a sweet wine because Shabbos is supposed to be sweet. Other holidays and festive occasions get a similar treatment, so you're likely to encounter sweet wines, sometimes very sweet, on the Jewish table. Also, thanks to accidents historical and demographic, the heart of kosher winemaking in America was, and still is, on the East Coast, and most of the grapes of choice for making American kosher wine were from grape species that were native to the U.S., like the Concord grape. These species are different from Vitis vinifera, the European species used to make most grape wines, and the general consensus is that grapes like Concord and its American cousins can't bring quality to the table in the same way that vinifera can. Finally, many, but not all, kosher wines go through a process of heating to make them mevushal, or cooked wines. We'll talk more about this process later, but the takeaway for now is that this heating process helps a wine keep its kosher status under certain circumstances where it otherwise might lose that status. Needless to say, the nicest thing you can usually say about a wine that's been heated during production is that the heating didn't do it any favors. And it's often a good bet that you can find some less than nice things to say as well. So, while it's true that kosher wine came by its reputation for sweetness and not so very goodness honestly, the fact is that none of these things we've talked about, including mevushal, is essential to making a kosher wine. And these days, kosher wines are made to every level of quality and dryness or sweetness out there, and in just about every possible wine style, including sparkling and dessert wines. So, general considerations aside, what actually is kosher wine? Well, to get the answer to that, you have to understand the special role that grape juice, either fermented or not fermented, plays in Judaism. Because offerings of wine were used in ancient Jewish worship of the God of Israel, the juice of the grape has a status in Judaism that other liquids don't have. In fact, grape juice and wine have their own unique bracha, or blessing, different from the ones for other foods, fruit juices, and alcoholic drinks. The problem is that wine wasn't just used in the worship of the God of Israel, but also in the worship of other gods that the Jewish tradition, being monotheistic, considers false. So Jews had to be careful to make sure that any wine they were consuming hadn't been offered or consecrated to another god, or had any part in any kind of idolatrous worship, what the ancient Israelites called avodah zarah. Any wine that was offered to another god was called yayin nesach, or libation wine, and it was forbidden for Jews to consume this wine or to get any benefit from it at all, like by selling it even to non-Jews. Now, you might think that the matter ends here, but there's an additional prohibition on consuming wine that's been handled by a non-Jew, and in some circumstances by a Jew who doesn't observe Jewish law, even if the wine hasn't been obviously offered to another god. Wine like this is called stam yayin, or ordinary wine. And the presumption here isn't necessarily that idolatry has taken place, and part of the reason the ancient rabbis legislated against this kind of wine was to cut down on the possibility of Jews drinking with, and then socializing with, non-Jews, as this might lead to intermarriage and weakening of the tradition down the road. Like yayin nesach, Jews are forbidden to consume stam yayin, but there's debate about whether or not they can benefit from it, say by selling it or by regifting a bottle. Keep in mind that the prohibition against ordinary contact with non-Jews or non-traditionally observant Jews only applies to the juice from grapes, not whole grapes. So none of this really becomes an issue until the juice is separated from the pulp of the grapes, something that would normally happen during crush for red grapes or during pressing for white. In Hebrew, this is called hamshacha. And once this happens, the resulting juice and the grape must, which is the combination of the juice and the pulp, can lose their kosher status if they're improperly handled. From here on in, the juice can only be handled by observant Jews who at a minimum practice traditional Sabbath observance, and who can be either male or female. If a non-Jew or non-observant Jew comes in contact with an unsealed container, including a barrel of this juice, or operates any machinery or equipment that causes this juice to move around, the juice and must lose their kosher status, and any fermented wine made from them can't be made kosher again. These same restrictions apply after the juice is fermented. So what's the practical effect of all this? Well, it means that starting from the time that the grapes are crushed or pressed, for the winemaker to have any contact with his wine, he or she needs to be a traditionally Sabbath-observant Jew in the eyes of the people who will be certifying his or her wine as kosher. The same goes for all employees of the winery if there's any chance that they can come in contact with the wine. If these conditions aren't met, then the winemaker will have to turn over production of the wine to a mashgiach, who will supervise other observant Jews in the actual production of the wine, with the winemaker giving instructions but not handling the juice or the wine. It's pretty standard in cases like this for the barrel or tank room of a kosher winery to be kept under lock and key by the mashgiach, so the wine can't be touched when he's not there. During production, if the winemaker wants to taste from the barrel or the tank, the wine will need to be drawn off by the mashgiach or an observant worker and brought to him or her. Needless to say, this adds an additional level of both hassle and expense to the process, and that's one reason why kosher wines will usually cost you more than a comparable non-kosher bottle. Now, once the wine's been bottled, a lot of these concerns are neutralized, and it can be handled by anyone since, being sealed, it can't be poured out or otherwise offered as a religious offering. So the distribution of kosher wine is pretty much like the distribution of any other kind of wine. But once a kosher bottle is opened, all of these issues come back in full force. So practically speaking, if a non-Jew, or in some opinions even a non-observant Jew, opens a kosher bottle of wine, the wine loses its kosher status, and the same thing happens if he or she picks up or otherwise moves the bottle. An observant Jew can pour kosher wine into the empty glass of a non-Jew, but once the non-Jew touches the glass, the wine in the glass becomes unkosher, and, according to some rulings, if more kosher wine is poured into the glass containing even a little bit of residue from the first pour, Not only does the new pour in the glass become unkosher, but the non-kosherness of the wine in the glass travels up the wine stream and renders any wine left in the bottle unkosher as well. This last bit is courtesy of a principle in Jewish law called nitzach, and the only solutions for it are either to rinse out the glass with water, or, if you're very strict about this sort of thing, to get a fresh glass for every pour for a non-Jew. As you can see, the logistics of having kosher wine open around non-Jews, or even non-observant Jews, gets very complicated. Incidentally, you might be thinking that all of this concern about idolatry seems a little dated, especially if you live in a country with a strong tradition of practicing a monotheistic faith like Christianity or Islam. You might be right, but for what it's worth, I once worked a grape crush for a winemaker friend of mine in Washington State. And after we were finished, my friend, who's a spiritual guy but in a new age kind of way, asked everyone who helped crush to stand by the fermentation tank that held the juice of our labors, put a hand on the tank and, quote, pray to any god you believe in to bless this wine, unquote. I'm not religious, but personally I thought the whole thing was pretty touching. But I'm also sure that if a traditionally observant Jew had walked into the middle of that, he might just have keeled over dead from the horror of seeing that much avodah zarah going on all at once. So point to the rabbis on this one. Interestingly, the rabbis did create a sort of workaround for all of this, but it's never been too popular among wine lovers because it involves heating the wine. Like I said before, wine that's been heated is called mevushal, and the rabbis ruled that mevushal wine wasn't acceptable for anyone, Jews or non-Jews, to offer to a god, any god. I guess on the grounds that any self-respecting god wouldn't want to drink cooked wine, so fair enough. What this means in practice is that if a wine hasn't lost its kosher status and then is heated or cooked, then it can be handled with no fear of losing that status because it's no longer suitable as an offering to a false god. The implications of this for kosher wine production and consumption are huge, because once this heating is done, the winemaker can handle her wine regardless of her Jewishness or level of observance, and non-Jews can open a bottle of mevushal wine and pour from it without compromising the wine's kosherus or kosherness. So how cooked does mevushal wine actually have to be? Opinions over the course of Jewish history have varied and ranged from just raising the temperature a little to actually seeing the wine boil. But probably the most widely held and followed ruling these days is that the wine has to come to at least 175 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 80 degrees Celsius, and only needs to maintain that temperature for a very short time and then can be cooled back down quickly. Basically, the wine is just being flash pasteurized, and while it probably doesn't benefit the wine any, it probably doesn't do too much harm, at least from a flavor standpoint. But whether or not flash pasteurization gets the juice hot enough or affects the flavor enough to qualify as mevushal is controversial, and not all observant Jews hold by that idea. If making a wine mevushal makes kosher winemaking and wine consumption easier, then why aren't all kosher wines made mevushal? The effect that heating has on the quality of the wine is one issue, but the bigger issue is that mevushal wine is, by definition, unfit to be offered to a god, including the God of Israel. So from the point of view of halacha, or Jewish law, it's preferable to fulfill a number of Jewish ceremonies that include drinking wine with wine that could be offered to the God of Israel, which means kosher, non-mevushal wines. So handy as mevushal is, non-mevushal wines aren't going anywhere. Lastly, how do you even know that a wine is kosher? Wines are designated kosher by mashgiachs working for a kosher certification agency, for a va'ad, or a council of rabbis, or for an individual rabbi. When the agency, council, or rabbi signs off on a wine, they award it a hechsher, or a kosher certification symbol. This symbol will appear somewhere on the label, and each symbol is unique to the agency, va'ad, or rabbi that awards it. Here are a few examples of hechshers and some other things you'll see on the label of kosher wine. This wine has two hechshers, one here and here. The one on the right is from a kosher certification agency in the U.S. called the Organized Kashrus Laboratories, or OK Kosher for short. The one on the left is the hechsher of a rabbi, Avraham Auerbach, who certifies in Israel. A clue as to why there are two hechshers on this wine has to do with this word, mehedrin. Mehedrin means something like embellished, and it means that the wine has been certified to a standard above and beyond what it needs to be to qualify as kosher. In other words, it means that the producers of this wine embellished their fulfillment of the requirement to produce a kosher wine by going beyond what they needed to. Not all agencies will certify a wine mehedrin because of controversies over just what the standards for it are. But a rabbi, like Rabbi Auerbach, holds by a set of standards that he considers to rise to that level, and he will certify wine to it. And since many observant Jews won't buy a wine that isn't certified mehedrin, the producers wanted a hechsher from someone who would certify it that way while still getting a hechsher from a large, widely recognized certifying agency like OK Kosher. Over here, you can see the letter P. This means that the wine is kosher for Passover. And this just means that the wine has had an extra level of supervision to make sure it hasn't come in contact with any food products that are off the table during that week-long holiday, but might otherwise be kosher. The label is also clear that this wine is not mevushal. That's something that won't always happen, since whether a wine is mevushal or is not is a really big deal in terms of serving and consuming the wine. Expect any wine that is mevushal to say so very clearly somewhere on the label. But wines that aren't mevushal won't necessarily say so like this one does. So the general rule is don't assume you're buying a mevushal wine unless that word is on the label. Here's a label for a kosher Oregon Pinot Noir that has a lot of the same things going on. Here's the hechsher of the OU, or Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, a major certifying agency headquartered in New York. Next to it is the Kosher for Passover P symbol and an indication that the wine isn't mevushal. The producers also chose to get additional certifications from the Va'ad, or Rabbinical Council of Oregon. There's the word Va'ad. And the personal hechsher of a rabbi named Fisher, who is certifying the wine as mehedrin. Note that Rabbi Fisher's hechsher is entirely in Hebrew, even though he's from the U.S., and that's an indication that the consumers for whom a hechsher like this would be important are coming from a background of very traditional observance. Here's a wine from Israel, and same deal as before. Multiple hechshers, here and here. Certified mehedrin in Hebrew. But in this case, it's clear that the wine is mevushal and has been cooked so that non-Jews can handle it when it's in an open container. So, you're not Jewish, but you've been invited to dinner by a nice Jewish family that you know keeps kosher, and you want to bring some vino. What should you bring? Well, start by looking for a hechsher, but make sure it's from a certifying agency or rabbi whose oversight your hosts accept. There probably isn't a single hechsher that all observant Jews can agree on, so the best thing to do is to ask your host what hechshers they hold by, and I guarantee you they'll be happy to tell you. Second, you should really bring something mevushal. Yeah, the non-mevushal stuff has a better chance of being better quality, but it's also a huge headache for your host to manage during dinner if there are any non-Jews at the table. So don't be surprised or offended if they opt not to drink it with you. On the bright side, they might just give you the whole bottle to drink yourself, so that's something, I suppose. Finally, unless your hosts were very specific about what you should bring, just consider not bringing any wine at all, and maybe show up with flowers or just your appetite. Keeping kosher is a big deal among observant Jews, and no one will be offended because you made that easier for them to do by not bringing a wine that everyone might not be willing to drink. Thanks for sticking with me through this cast. We covered a lot of ground, but I hope it was interesting and useful information. Just a couple of quick disclaimers before I sign off. First, I'm not a scholar of halacha or Jewish law, and I'm really more of a halacha fanboy. So if I've erred on a point of law or tradition, or if you just want to kibitz, let me know in the comments. Second, As should be obvious to some listeners, I pronounce Hebrew in the Ashkenazi or Eastern European style as opposed to the Sephardi or Middle Eastern Israeli style. So, for example, while I say mevushal and kashrus, there are lots of folks who say mevushal or kashrut, or kashrut if you really want to go full Israeli. So if you're learning these words for the first time here on this Winecast, just be aware that somewhere out there there's a Jew waiting to correct your pronunciation, and you just can't win no matter what style you choose. If you enjoyed this cast, please like or subscribe if you haven't already, and feel free to leave a comment. I'm the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.